So thank you both for being here. It's been a wonderful, adventurous weekend. So why don't we get started and just sort of talk about how this whole project began? Whoever wants to take that.
How did it?
How did it begin?
Well, my father died, Ray died in November of 2013. And I was there at the apartment that I grew up in on East 10th Street. And my brother came down, when my father was ailing. And I ended up living in the apartment for a little while, trying to take care of the stuff, we were trying to get the landlord to give us some time to clear out all the stuff. And I knew there would be some paintings, and I started going through them. I started going through closets and boxes and portfolios and under beds and under couches and all kinds of hidden places, and began to pull out huge numbers of works that I had never seen before, my brother had never seen before, and that probably no one alive had seen. So I started looking through them, I started cataloging them, and I think it was my father-in-law, Joe Schwerin, the late Joe Schwerin, who was friends, good old friends with Ted, who contacted him, and I wrote Ted an email. Ted was very gracious, even though I'm sure part of him cringed at the idea of having to look at a bunch of paintings done by the father of some semi-relative, of some semi-friend of his, you know. Oh no, another big pile of shit that I have to spend my valuable time looking at and somehow cushioning the fall for the poor deluded person. So Ted showed up at the apartment and we made an appointment. He showed up, and the first thing he did was ask for a cup of tea. And I made him, and that was clever because he got me into the kitchen while he went and started looking at paintings without me around. He thinks that I didn't notice this, and that I didn't understand it. And I made him tea, and Ted looked around the apartment for quite a while, an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, you know, muttering certain things to himself that were, some of which I understood, others I didn't. And then finally, he sat down with his half-drunk cup of tea and said, and I knew that I was going to get the judgment here, you know, I was going to get the assessment. He said, well, he's not the greatest. Now, in my world, when you say he's not the greatest, I mean, imagine somebody recommending a restaurant to you. And you go to that restaurant, and then they say, well, how'd you like it? It wasn't the greatest. It's your euphemism for saying, my God, what a horror. Bringing mediocrity to new lows. But he immediately followed it up by saying, he's not de Kooning, he's not Klein, he's not Pollock. He's just under them, right? He's the real thing. He knows what he's doing. And I wasn't waiting for him to hear that so that I would know whether the work was good. I was waiting to hear that because I knew the work was good. Because I was so moved by it, and I was predisposed to not like it, you know, for all kinds of reasons. But it meant that I could work with him. And that's exactly what we've done. We've worked together really well, really good team. Ted is a wonderful person to work with, very smart, imaginative, and open. And so that's how it all began. And we've been working on it for a year and a half, you know, step by step, little by little, creating something, ex nihilo, creating something where there was nothing. And that's the closest I'm going to get to giving birth. I hope. But until my book comes out.
Thanks, Paul. I already can see about 15 interesting directions this could take. But as Paul suggested, in my position as curator, I get calls from people whose husband, grandmother, or someone was a painter. There are a lot, it really makes you think, but there are a lot of attics full of paintings by a relative, and they're often pretty good. They're people who dedicated their lives to art, so I'm never cavalier about that. It makes you think about all the artists and how little ever gets an exhibition or a reputation for the artist, and what happens to all the other art. I'm a great, always been a believer in the underdog. So and the art. Paul quotes his dad in his essay as lamenting the Disneyfication of the art world. He saw a Disneyfication of the art world in the 1960s. So if he were brought back in 2016, he'd have a lot different words, and they wouldn't be so complimentary. The art world has had a giant revolution, and in some ways a good one. Modern art, abstract art, is now widely accepted. Nobody says, "Oh, my kid could do that." It's amazing. My wife and I went to Miami, Boston this last December, and we saw there are about 500 galleries exhibiting the work of 7,000 or 8,000 painters, all in one city at one time, all 20th century or 21st century. So it's just exploded. But the process of finding, for me, the process of finding Ray, turning them over in a dark apartment, and realizing there's quality there. They're all very dirty, they're unframed, they hadn't been cleaned, and thinking there's quality here. Let's find out what's going on here. And then it's been a thrill both to work with Paul and the material, because I've never worked from the absolute base level of all the dirty paintings, and then get to an exhibition, publication is very exciting. I've learned a lot, and we had to find there was very little money to spend on this. We had to find an excellent conservator in New York who gave us a very reasonable price and cleaned all these paintings. And we had to find a very good framer, which I found in Boston, who gave us a wonderful rate. They're all they're framed as well as you would frame a de Kooning or anything. They deserve that attention, I thought. So, and the catalog that Alice produced is a first-rate, absolute first-rate, beautifully designed catalog. And Paul, as Alice said, wrote a very moving essay about his dad and his memories. I tried to put it into context of what's the chronology. Art historians want to know what came first, where did he start, how did he proceed, who did he learn from, and so on.
So I think that leads to my next question. Could we just give a snapshot of Ray's life and career as an artist, maybe starting just before his summer at Black Mountain College, and then just briefly up to his death, so everyone kind of has a sense of his sort of ebbing and flowing as an artist, and maybe the primary influences.
Well, it sounds like a tag team.
What's that?
It sounds like a tag team.
Yeah, it is.
We got to do this together. I mean, my father was just prior to Black Mountain.
I want one of these mugs to take.
Yes. Well, I've already decided that. My father he was a pilot in World War II. He flew the Hump over Himalayas, in Burma, India, and China. He was a transport pilot. He flew a C-47. And he went off to war after the War Department decided that, imagine them being this insightful now. They decided that that art students and artists would make the best pilots because they had this terrific spatial awareness, right? They understood relations in space. Now, perhaps that's ridiculous, but at least they were thinking imaginatively, and so what they did was they went to schools, and at that time my father was at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and he was taking a course in commercial art design, advertising design. He hadn't yet discovered, exactly what he wanted to do, and he went into the Army, and he came back with the highest honor that the Army Air Corps gives, the Distinguished Flying Cross, as did a couple of other pilots. It was very, very dangerous duty. But while he was in the service, he saw things that he would never have seen in Brooklyn, which is where he grew up, in the area close to what we would call Bedford-Stuyvesant now. He saw India, he saw China, he saw Burma, he fell in love with Burma. He saw lots of different kinds of people and things and art that he would never have seen otherwise. He comes back, he finishes up his certificate at Pratt in 1948, and then he's reading what I originally thought, and I think I may have gotten this wrong in my essay. I thought it was The Nation, but it may have actually been The New Republic. He saw an ad in the back for this college that he'd never heard of, saying that they were going to be giving painting classes, art classes in the summer session, and he had the summer available. And so he decided, I never heard of this Black Mountain place, but I think I'll try that out. And so he enrolled and came down. After Black Mountain, he sort of, life is messy, life is disorganized. He thought, okay, well, I guess what I'm doing now is I'm going to go get a job in graphic design. And he went and worked for Helena Rubinstein for about 6 months. They had their own in-house advertising department. And then suddenly he had the opportunity to go to Rome and study art, study painting in Italy. So he went, he asked if he could get a leave of absence, and they said, no, if you quit, you quit. He said, okay, I'll quit. So he went to Rome. He said he saw every church in Rome and learned a lot from masters and studied with some pretty good Italian painters. And then after a year and a half, in I guess that would be 1950, I think, 1950, he comes back to New York. And this is an interesting sideline, but I'm going to turn it over to Ted and take us more through the artistic trajectory. When he, what the Venice Biennale is. It was, and it has a very old vintage, but it obviously stopped during the war. It was dedicated to the most progressive avant-garde styles in Europe, and then later in the States. And the second Biennale after the end of the war, my father, I have a postcard, which he's telling his mother, a postcard to Brooklyn, that he's on his way to Venice to attend that Biennale. And I looked up that Biennale on the internet, did a little research, I like doing research, and I found out that that was the first exposure of Europe to a young American painter who nobody knew till that point in Europe, by the name of Jackson Pollock. And that he, the big people were the Cubists and, the Mexicans, Diego Rivera, and people like that. They were dominating at that point. But there was also this guy, Jackson Pollock, and I imagine this moment where my father, who didn't know about Pollock at that time in New York, suddenly sees this in Venice of all places, and comes back having seen a Pollock, right? He comes back and he immediately gets ensconced in the Lower Manhattan art scene, gets an apartment there, reconnects with his teacher, Bill Kooning, reconnects with Pat Paslow, and from there,
the rest of the story.
The rest of the story.
So Ray, making the decision to come to Black Mountain for the summer session of 1948, by accident, hit on the hotbed of American modernism. There's never been anything like Black Mountain. And Ray, when he signed up, he saw the ad in a magazine, he signed up, and they were advertising that the painting teacher would be Mark Tobey, but it was Mark Tobey's were nice, very nice painter, small scale, beautiful graphic, small paintings, quite cerebral. But at the last moment, Tobey couldn't come, so they scattered around and they got Bill de Kooning. Bill de Kooning himself, Bill de Kooning was 44, Ray was 24, but de Kooning was just beginning to have a reputation in New York. He was unknown, but in April of that year, just before the summer, April of 48, de Kooning had his first one-man show, and it was all his black and white paintings, which are incredibly beautiful series of paintings, and it was his first breakthrough, very beautiful abstract painting. So then he went to teach. They invited de Kooning to teach in place of Tobey. So Ray found himself studying with both de Kooning, the abstract expressionist, and with Joseph Albers, the rigorous color theorist. We'll get into a little more about this the dual influence of Albers and de Kooning. So then Ray, back in New York, was painting these paintings.
So there, Ray is immersed in the scene, but then he stops painting. Can we talk
Well,
about that?
Ray had a moment of success with paintings like this one, and this one. These are grand, serious, worthy paintings, and in 1960, he sold 3 of them to Joseph Hirshhorn. It was just found in his museum, and he sold one of them to the Walker Art Center, where Milton Friedman was the director and curator. He was a brilliant avant-garde guy. So Ray had this moment of success, and then within a couple of years, along came Warhol and Jasper Johnson and Rauschenberg, great artists, but a total difference of style. This style suddenly went out of fashion as quickly as the Edsel did, about the same time. And then Ray was back to painting for himself, and there were no more cooperative galleries. The art world had changed. It was an influx of money, and he had no place to show. And by the 70s, he was pretty much stopped. But Paul will correct this, and did you, we want to know, I want to know, did your father discuss his art? Did you watch him paint? What was it like?
Well, I can remember the 60s. What do they say about those who can remember the 60s? They weren't there. I can remember the 60s, and I can remember the early 70s before I went to college. I remember Ray painting at home. More, I remember him painting in a studio. Maybe it was on Ludlow Street, or it was on Great Jones Street. I can't remember. Somewhere in that Bowery East Side, Lower East Side area. I remember being asked to staple canvases. I remember the smell of oil paint. I remember that he used Joan Ward's apartment right around the corner. Joan Ward was de Kooning's girlfriend at the time, and the mother of his only child, Lisa, who was my childhood best friend. And so we were tight. The Joan Ward Lisa thing, and Bill sort of out in Long Island.
But the good was married to Elaine at the time.
Yes, he was married to Elaine, but Joan was one of his several, extramarital honeys. And Ray and Joan let set up a workspace in that apartment. Occasionally she would go out and live in Springs, in Long Island, where Bill was, where de Kooning was. So I was there. I was given a key because I was in high school, and I needed a place to be other than high school and that tiny apartment we grew up in. So I was given a key so I could go there and listen to Donovan and the Beatles on an old broken down record player, and just, do that thing.
They had records then.
They had records. So what I remember about Ray painting and his son, he didn't speak about painting. In fact, Clyde has the best phrasing of this. He said, in our house, art was the most important thing and the one thing we couldn't under any circumstances discuss. Right. So, this is an interesting sideline to the art historical perspective. That is that he was very private about this. He kept the two, to a great extent, separate. Although the social life of artists, we were very much included in. So we got schlepped out. I don't remember how many times he did it with you, but probably a good number. Me, many times. Schlepped out to the Cedar Tavern, on University Place, where it was smoky and noisy and everybody was drinking, and we got, little Shirley Temples with a cherry, maraschino cherry on top, and, we'd be there and there'd be all this shouting, and for all I know, it was like Pollock throwing things, whatever, and we were part of that world, but only in the sense that the abstract expressionist movement, the action painting movement, the 10th Street movement, was very, very importantly a community. It was a community. It wasn't just it wasn't at all some egghead, theoretical, we were following an idea of painting. These guys got drunk together, they smoked endless cigarettes together, they talked about their sexual conquests, and they were mostly guys, right? It was not an environment that was hospitable to women as equal members, although Joan Mitchell was a famous exception.
Tell us about de Kooning babysitting for you.
Well, my mother was for better or for worse, a very devoted mother, but even she got sick of having, little kids around, and we couldn't afford babysitters. Occasionally we would have the Ukrainian woman across the way, Mrs. Dublanek, shriveled little prune of the Ukrainian woman, come in with her babushka, talking language we couldn't understand. But just as often, we would get sent, I don't know about you, but I would get sent across the street to 88. So I grew up on 95 East 10th Street, which is where the March Gallery was. Right? So the March Gallery was actually in the basement of the building we grew up in. And across the street, if you're facing south to the south end of 10th Street, towards a little bit over to the right towards 4th Avenue, was a walk-up that was 88 East 10th Street, and that's where the Kooning studio was. And so it was very easy and very convenient to bring us over, or bring me over, to play with Lisa in the Kooning studio. And so that happened. That was kind of one of, fairly, I don't know if it was regular, but it happened a few, several times that I remember. And Bill, this, insane, diminutive Dutchman, with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth constantly, was supposed to be our babysitter, and supposed to take care of us. And to his credit, nothing terrible happened. He didn't pay any attention to us. We were often other.
He didn't make you little cups of cocoa?
No, he didn't. He didn't bring us toys. He might have thrown a couple of things at us. But, don't bother me. But he was, he was very, very intense painter. He painted very differently than my father did.
So describe de Kooning painting.
So de Kooning, quite often I remember that he was terrified. I mean, he would be standing in front of the canvas that was maybe that size or larger, right? He'd be standing on it, and he would be looking at it. He'd be glaring at it as though it were like his enemy, his enemy that he was going to have to, like he was like some kind of medieval knight who was going to have to like conquer the dragon, He was girding his loins, and then he would run at it. He would sprint at it from about 25 feet away, 30 feet away, with it, armed instead of with the sword and the battle axe, armed with his brushes, and he would like run at this thing, and he would attack it, and he'd go, and you'd see and he would make grunting sounds, and the ash would be flying off his cigarette, and then he'd run back 25, 35 feet and look at it, and start, and he'd be getting all worked up, and Lisa and I are like 4 years old. We're trying to play. We had one of those. I don't know if they exist anymore, but they're kind of like rockers with a seat in one side and the other. And the image. I mean, if you could have brought the camera in there, we're going. I'm a cheetah. And he was going. It was peculiar. It was a peculiar world to grow up in. But to get to the point that you were raising, Alice, he didn't talk to us about painting. It was a very private thing. I felt that if I were to ask about this thing that I barely understood, art, which was clearly something else than just painting a picture. There was something else happening than just that. If I were to ask about, I feared that I would be history. I would be like flung out the window or something. It was a very scary topic to broach. And yet we did see things change over time. We saw that it was very, and mostly we saw it in terms of the social world, of the community, right? We saw that people were moving out of New York. They were either succeeding and like cocooning and going to Long Island, and East Hampton, and getting money, or they were moving out of town because they wanted to raise their kids in a less scary place. Schools were better, whatever, or they died, like Franz and Rothko, and they were just Pollock, of course, and they were just gone. And so the scene, see, that's the operative word, is the word you have to really get. The scene disintegrated. And when the scene disintegrated, people stopped painting, and it wasn't just my daughter that stopped painting. People stopped painting. They moved to Hoboken, they moved to Connecticut, they moved to places on Long Island, and they just became regular people. I beg your pardon.
Somebody's phoning in a question for the panelists. Good answer.
You did that on purpose, didn't you?
Yeah, well, the strange thing is that was Susan Rue calling. And Susan Rue, I'm glad to be reminded of her because she designed the catalog. And it's a very, very high quality, beautiful design. She was great to work with. So I didn't answer her, but.
Thank you, I was just hitting one strike. But we did notice that he was doing it less. And I did notice that he wasn't going around the corner to Joan Ward's apartment anymore. I did notice that probably he began, and this is the other side of it, he probably began at that time to have more serious and lengthy bouts of depression. And I'm probably not at this point telling tales out of school to say that he would on a fairly regular basis go into his bedroom and stay there for a week and just brood and would not talk to anybody. He would just lie in bed. And at that time, we didn't quite, maybe somebody knew the word depression, but we didn't really know the word depression the way we know it now, right? It had, Prozac hadn't gotten onto the cover of Time magazine yet in the way it did in the 90s. So he really was personally, psychologically, emotionally reeling from the loss of his world. This was the world that he had discovered that allowed him to escape Brooklyn, the provincialism of Brooklyn, the small-mindedness of his family, you know. He had greater ideas, he had bigger dreams, and he found those dreams, he found he could realize those dreams in the art scene. And it was friendship, and it was conversation, and it was drinking, it was laughter, but above all, it was art. It was art. And then that started to go. Who did he have to talk to? Me. You know, Clyde, his wife. You know, it wasn't the same thing. And I think that it really put a crimp in his ability. And I think he tried to stick it out. And you know, in the end, more than just about anybody else, he did stick it out. He did. He never moved from that apartment. He stayed there. And although he did, in the 1970s, stop painting and turn to other ways of getting community and justifying his existence on the planet, he came back to it. He came back to it in the 90s and painted for the last, 10, 12 years of his life, 15 years?
Until the last couple of years.
Until the last couple of years of his life. A very different style, which you don't see here, because it's so different. But he came back to it, and he was constantly retouching and revising. And I don't remember who I was telling. Yeah, these much more figurative. But
These are from around.
these are from the 90s or first decade of the
Right.
2000s. You know, as he started to get demented, I'm not sure who I told the story to. I think it was you. He started to. You would stand there. He would. Interestingly, and this is one of the sort of lovely things. He began to be able to talk about art, which is something he'd never done before. As his mind went, his heart opened in certain ways. And so he would say things like, he would walk into a room and he would have a few paintings up and he'd say, "What do you think of that one?" And I'd look, I'd say, "I like it." He said, and he'd point to like the top left quadrant and he'd say, "That's good. That works. The rest of it I have to do something with." And he would do something with it. He would try to erase, he would try to cover over or whatever. And as he got more and more demented, he began to imagine that there was some other guy who had done the original painting. So he would talk about, this is funny, he would look at it, he would say, "This other guy didn't understand. He didn't get it. He didn't get it right." I said, "What other guy?" You know, the guy that did the painting. You know, he was totally serious, and he said, "I'm going to fix it. You know, he's going to fix this thing that he got." And this went on for a year or so. And then one day I was in the apartment, and he's progressively getting more, losing his marbles, you know. And I go in, and we do our normal thing, looking at we had the original Cedar Tavern. He had ended up with the bar of it. So we had the bar of the Cedar Tavern there, which he used to prop up his paintings and sort of display them. And the bottom part he used for his art supplies and other things. And we were looking, as we often did, at this painting, and he was saying, "I'm not sure about this section." And I, having been well trained, said, "Yeah, that other guy didn't get it right. You know, you have to fix it." And he looked at me and winked. He said, "There is no other guy." So those of us who have had parents that have struggled with dementia know that you go in and out. You know, you have awareness, and then you lose the awareness and understand the clarity. And that was a funny moment. We both had a big laugh over that. There is no other guy. You're right. There is none. So, all right.
Did he? That's great. Yeah, that's great. It's really great. Did he? So all his late hundreds and hundreds of drawings are of nude women.
Yes.
Did he have a model?
Yes, he went to what they call a sketch class or an art class, which isn't a class, as many of you know. It's actually just a bunch of painters who hire a model together in a place, and he would go to that group. I would say a couple of times a week, maybe more, you know. And he would, they would all paint, and they were very quick. do a great, we call them drawings because they sort of look like drawings and they're on paper, but they were actually done with a brush, and they were a wash. They were kind of like a black powder suspended in water or something. I don't know what liquid it was, but it was like what I call a black and white watercolor. Right? So it was that kind of style. And they would all do that, and they'd rip off the paper, throw it behind them, and do another one from a different angle. So he did that for years and years, and I estimate that we have at least 2,500.
And what he would do, the ones he thought were promising, he would work on at home.
Yes.
You know, they would do real quickly in the
Take 'em
studio, and then he would work on the ones that he liked and thought could be improved.
Exactly. And it was a huge research project for him for a while to figure out the proper tools to use to erase and do over. Apparently, that particular medium was very difficult to do that. And he was in constant sort of negotiations with New York Central Art Supply Company on 3rd Avenue between 10th and 11th, you know, going in there saying, "It's not working," you know, which is how he could talk. "It's not working, you know, I need something back."
So this is Ray had one lifetime one-man show in 1960. So this is, you're sitting in his second one-artist show.
Right.
Been devoted to him. For whatever, that's just a footnote.
But he was invited to all the stable gallery shows.
But
And he showed all
in
the stable
the
gallery
50s,
shows.
he was well known. He was in all the regular group shows.
Yes, with the exception of the 9th Street show, which I don't know why he wasn't. I don't know if he was asked and declined or whether he wasn't asked yet. He wasn't considered important enough at that time or something. But when was the 9th Street
The
show?
9th Street show was 1951, sort of a landmark show, but he was just back from
He was just back from Europe, so.
just getting to know everybody.
So yeah, it's quite possible he wasn't even known at all.
So, you want to open it up to questions, or do you have another?
I have
Direction.
just a couple more questions for Ted. When you see as a dream scenario or trajectory for Ray Spillinger's work from now going forward?
I think, well, I had a phone call this morning from the director of the Museum of Modern Art who said, I've heard about the Spillinger show and I want to, no, I'm just
You're
making
making
that,
that
I'm making that up. I have no idea.
Well, this show is traveling.
This show is traveling to Purchase, New York, to a very distinguished museum, the Neuberger Museum. It's going to be larger there, same catalog. And then we'll see, but Paul and Clive will have given him his chance, and I think they're good paintings, so we'll see what happens. The art world, anyone who wants to talk about reputations and how things happen in the art world and all that, that's an interesting subject. The fact is, no one knows exactly. That's the long and short of it is, the art world has become more and more mysterious, and the way reputations are built or not built is a complicated thing. There are thousands of very good artists now working, all of whom are trying to establish a foothold, but there's increasing interest in abstract expressionism and in older artists who were, as I told Paul, the real deal, who were working in the 1940s. They're not making any more of them.
They're being discovered.
And I think Ray has a rightful position in that world.
Anybody want to throw out a question for?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, in the essays, and you've both mentioned that the 10th Street apartment is very dark, and a lot of Ray's work is incredibly moody. What were his other light sources other than those? Did he have a lighting setup, or do you think that the lighting had an effect on the moodiness of his paintings?
Well, it was dark at that time, right? We had an area of the house that we called up front. We would say, well, let's go up front. And they'd say, what? We're talking about? You mean the living room? And that place was very light. was a big area, a big open area. My father had taken down several non-supporting walls there when they first moved in. And it had 3 big windows that I think probably went from about the bottom of this painting to maybe slightly higher than the top of the painting. And so us, when we were growing up, that could be a very, very light, open area, lots of natural light coming in. It faced east on 3rd Avenue, which meant, and at that time, there were no huge mega buildings there. NYU hadn't taken over the area and built their horrendous, horrific student dormitories, which blocked out so much light, right? So you got plenty of light, especially in the morning, right, coming in there, streaming in there. There were curtains, but they were usually all pulled back, both on the top and the bottom, right? So there was plenty of light there. As the years went by, buildings went up. The lights that we did have there broke and never were fixed, right? My father had no money at all. We didn't grow up with money, and he lived off of Social Security, pretty much. When things broke, they broke. And in the old days, he could have fixed them. But later in life, he wasn't able to. So I think a lot of the curtains were pulled, and there's no light coming through windows, and the overhead lights weren't working. And I think that made it in actuality much, much darker. But growing up, that room was not dark. Is that true?
That's true. Although one thing I would add is that this is long before I was born, but at some point, the 3rd Avenue L was torn down. Now, 56, so probably not long after they moved into that apartment. So it was along 3rd Avenue, actually quite limited light because of the subway, elevated subway, and then once that got knocked down, then it was practical to paint in that apartment. But I'm not sure it would have been prior.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know whether when they moved in, whether the L was already down.
Yeah.
But the paintings are not brooding. The paintings are full of color and life and light.
And no one is more surprised by that than us, because mostly what we saw were what you would call a muddy palette. So for us, this is pretty bright. There was a lot of. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but that is pretty bright.
Yeah.
For us, we had a lot of what I considered sort of ocean green. Ocean green of the Baltic Sea variety, green, right? So we grew up with a lot of that, and one of the reasons this was such a shock to us was that so all the paintings were facing the wall, right? So those that were, the canvases were stretched. We didn't even see them. We saw the back end of it. We saw the ass of the painting, right? So we didn't even know. And those that we did see were really murky. And in fact, some of the people who first came in, before you came in, said, he likes the muddy palette, And that was before we cleaned them.
And before comes a lot of color.
Yes.
And color and light.
And that's one of the reasons my brother loves that one so much. And I love it too.
The red and blue one.
Yeah, the one right there, because, oh my God, red.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, he used red. I never saw it before. And the truth is, as you look around, you can see that he's doing lots of things other than murk. But oddly, we didn't see as much of that as the murk.
This is a wonderful painting, and I love sitting here by chance. I hadn't realized the intelligence of it, the speed of it. These drips are all very purposeful. He doesn't like all the abstract expressionists. He relies on chance and motion, so that they're meant to look like very quick brushstrokes, but they're very heavy. They're very pieces of paint that play a three-dimensional role in the canvas, and then it lightens, in a sense, here. There's a kind of landscape element to it, but you'd never call it a landscape. You can't, but when we see anything with anything like a horizon, we kind of think of landscape, sun breaking through and rain, but those are unimportant associations. Really, it's about painting. These paintings are about painting, and they're with this very intelligent, limited, what Paul thought was muddy is a very smart, limited palette where he purposely has little light areas that give it energy and quality. It's terrific. The same thing is true of that painting and the blue and black painting. And like sitting where I'm sitting behind you can't see this, but the Kooning's paintings of women are very well known, and I'm sitting there admiring this painting because it reminds us of the Kooning. I'll grab that on the side. I want you to see it closely because you think of the big, powerful, can you see that? The big, powerful de Kooning paintings are all about sex and sexuality. They reach out and grab you with various body parts. And Ray is thinking a little about de Kooning, but doesn't do that. He puts the elements of the face up where you can barely see it, and then it's all about painting. It's really an abstract painting. And this very brilliant yellowish green corner gives it light and air and gives the implication that there's a real world here. It's a real world. And this is brilliant painting all through here. All this rich palette, pinks, oranges, all of de Kooning's colors used here, but in a different way than de Kooning would have used. So there's none of the misogynist attitude toward women that de Kooning had, but still it's somehow related to de Kooning. Alice, I apologize for taking this off your wall. Let's take it back.
It's interesting that you talk about misogyny. I think it's clear. I mean, this is one of the things that.
Just leave it at the end. We'll have professional people.
Yeah.
Put it back.
One of the things that in researching this project that I found from talking to those women that are still alive.
If you're the curator. I've done this at the Louvre. They find it shocking.
They do too. They're just too polite to tell you. And one of the things that, I mean, in our, when he was alive and when we were younger, we knew that Ray was kind of a ladies' man.
You knew he was.
He was kind of a ladies' man. Like how many times did I bring home a girlfriend, and we'd hang around and talk, and then later we'd be out somewhere, and she'd say, why can't you be more like your father? I don't tell this to everybody. It's just a close-knit group of people, and then speaking to a couple of women who knew him in the 50s. One of them in particular, a woman named Joan Matthews, who was a painter and a gallery owner, who lives in Albany now. She's quite old. She says she remembers that whenever a new woman painter would come into the gallery or come into the scene, Ray was always really interested in them. He would spend a lot of time. He loved women. I don't think there was really a misogynist bone in his body. He loved women in all And so, but doing this research, and so that would be a thing perhaps that supports your view of how he painted women. And all these 2,500 to 3,000 drawings are of women, right? That we have in the final phase.
There's some men.
Oh yeah, there's some men, but most of them are they use female models. There are some men, and some of them, in my opinion, Ted is not that interested in them. But some few of them I really like and are really beautiful, and they tell me something about how he looked at them.
No, I'm getting more interested in them.
You are? Take a little credit for that.
I think we should have a show. Yeah, a whole exhibition. I think they're
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's next.
But
Yeah.
I think there have to be questions.
Any other questions?
Yeah, questions.
Curious, would Ray work on one painting until he was finished? Did he have a lot of paintings going on at the same time? Was he a quick painter? I mean, did he finish things quickly?
He worked on one painting at a time. That's my memory of it. In the later stages, he would be, fiddling with things. When he was older and he was looking at old paintings, he would fiddle. He would do a little something with this, and then he'd go over here and he'd do a little something with that. Right? He did that with the drawings, and he did it with his old work. But at the time, I'm just trying to cast back to images out of my cobwebby memory, and what I remember is that there would be one painting on a kind of a thing made of 2x4s, kind of a structure, kind of an easel, and it would stay there for a while, and I don't know how long it took him to finish a painting. I saw him as being a very methodical painter. That there would be thinking going on before he made a brushstroke. In other words, he would stand there and he would look, and then he seemed to. Now, it's so long ago, and so I could be just making all this up. But my sense of it was that he would think for a while, have an idea for what he wanted to do, and then go paint, right? And then go do it, and then it would be a section of it that was done. And maybe the actual implementation of it might have quickness to it, right? But it was not indecisive. It was he knew what he was going to do. Boom, boom. Then he'd step back, And he was. It's kind of interesting. Let me just add this one thing. I don't want to take too much time there, but there weren't a lot of things that my father decided he was going to teach me, right? We didn't, he took my brother out to a number of ball games, but I didn't get taken that many times. And playing catch was a rare event.
Dodgers.
No, Mets. In their halcyon days. But one thing he did teach me, we were painting a room in the house, putting a fresh coat of paint on it. And I knew my father was a painter. I was old enough to know that. And we were on ladders, step ladders, and we were going up. Our ceilings were pretty high. And he had me painting, and I was like having a good old time, I was concentrating on this little thing. I had a little brush, and sort of a toy brush, painting little things, and trying to get it just right, because one felt in that household that you had to get it just right? But he said, "No, you're being too careful. Look at what I'm doing." And he would take like a brush full of paint and just smash it into the wall, right? Just go bleh. And he says, "Get it on there. Once it's on there, smooth it out, right?"
Yeah.
Now that one piece of advice, I think, does two things. It affects me for the rest of my life, in my writing, in filmmaking, in music, in everything I do. It's a matter of getting it on there, not being too precious about it. Get it on there, and then that's where you work with it. You don't work with it on the brush. You work with it on the canvas, right? And it also, I think, tells us something about his technique. not just as a painter of rooms, right, but as a painter of paintings, you know, yeah.
Just wanted to add one thing, that in my recollection, in the early, I think it was probably in the early 70s, or late 60s, that this piece and the one
Yes.
in the corner, he had a whole series where he was doing these using this sort of semi-geometric kind of aspect to it, and he had several up at once and using different color combinations and
Right.
patterns to experiment with. So that was one instance I can remember in which he had a common theme of working on several things at once.
So those are the two, it's good, glad pointed those out, those are the two latest paintings in the show. And if we had to do it over again, we probably should have included some more of those. They're interesting, they're different, and
Was he using masking tape for this?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was masking tape to get the straight edge.
Those are from the 60s, right?
they're 60s or early
I think
70s.
early 70s.
Yeah.
And they show a reaction, they show him reacting to what's going on as abstract expressionism fades, and certain other artists with these hard edges are coming into fashion. But these are very good paintings. Susan chose one for the cover, and it'd be nice to show them as a group. That's another show we could do.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about his showing his work, and I guess I understand that he did show in group shows and had a certain amount of success, and then at one point he really refused to show anymore, even though in your essay you said that de Kooning and Klein urged him to.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any real sense or understanding of why that was, other than more than what you've said today about the change in style and change in the manner of painting that was going on.
Well, this is something that Clyde and I are going to have to answer together, because I think maybe between the two of us we have something like an accurate view of this. I'm not sure why, I'm not sure what the roots of this are, but my father he was very cool, right? He thought cool was important. He thought there were things that were déclassé. He thought that there were things that demeaned him as an artist and demeaned the art. He was one of the more, I think, diehard and radical true believers in that. And he thought, and I think that part of the explanation for this is he didn't want to get his hands dirty in the world of commerce. He didn't want to demean what he was doing or demean himself by being a self-promoter, by being an operator. For all his wild shenanigans and his reputation as a crazy drunk, Pollock was a superb manipulator of the media. He was incredible. He was incredible operator. And de Kooning, of course, was as well. I mean, he got in bed with the Uptown Galleries as soon as he could and never looked back. Klein knew better than either of those two that something terrible was happening as soon as he got his first major paycheck. Because he was offered, he got one, and before he died. And my father talked about him saying, "It's the end." I mean, he needed the money, but at the same time, and he took it, right? But he knew that it was the end, right? And this was in 1960, 61, right? So my father felt that anything he did to try to promote himself was not, he felt uncomfortable about it. That doesn't tell us why he didn't show, in ways that were more congenial to him. And I think there was a sense, and I think, maybe I should let you talk about the whole notion of him not having the same kind of personality as de Kooning.
I'll say something that sounds on the surface like it's in conflict with with what Paul's saying, but actually it's quite consistent with it. In 1997, after our mother died, my father came out to visit me in California for a week or two, and as Paul said, the subject of art and painting and his relationship was not something that was comfortable to discuss, and we never much discussed it, but on this occasion, for whatever reason, I managed to wheedle a few things out of him about it, and having to do with his having stopped painting. That's not such subjects to bring up. And, he was what I took to be quite candid about something that I hadn't understood, which was essentially the overwhelming anxiety of painting in general, but painting in the context of that group of very tough-minded artists in the 50s and 60s. And I got the sense that, at least in part, that became a little bit of a paralyzing thing for him, that it was so overwhelming for, in that anxiety way. And I think the words apple and tree have come to my mind a lot during this whole conversation. I think I kind of get this, that there's sort of an interplay between the sort of conscious principle issue of not wanting to demean the art and the underlying tremendous conflict and anxiety about entering the fray that I think both play together and sort of helping in part to explain why he stopped, why he didn't join the others, even at their urging, to exhibit more. But it's always going to be, for me, only partial at best as an explanation. But I think the two things really both work.
Yeah, I think so.
Is there a particular historical movement that influenced modern art, or
Say that again.
is there a particular historical movement that was going on in the world that caused these sentiments that kind of sparked modern art? Or?
Well, I started with, yes, that's the answer, and the artist in New York had a very, very strong sense of history, and Picasso in 1906 changed everything with the invention of Cubism, changed the worldview. You can't imagine a more dramatic change from the 19th century, the realism of the figures, suddenly painting everything on a flat, abstract surface. So everybody's thinking about Picasso. He's the great artist of the period. And then along the 20s and 30s, along comes Surrealism and Dada and abstraction and Mondrian. All these movements, all in Europe. There wasn't a significant American artist. There were some very good American artists, but the great artists were European. We had George O'Keeffe and people like that who were good, but nothing on that level. The avant-garde was European. And then the war came, Europe is destroyed. Many of the best European artists came to New York in 1940, 41, 42. Mondrian and the Surrealists and Leger, many of the others. So they're in New York, but they're demoralized and getting older. Then there's this group of very young American painters who are either in the war, like Ray, or not in the war, like Pollock, who are searching for a style. There are a handful of patrons, like Peggy Guggenheim, the major one, the Museum of Modern Art, major one, looking hungrily, Clement Greenberg, the critic, hungrily looking for an American art. And out of the ashes of all that, you have Pollock in 1947, 48, creating his drip style. De Kooning said, Jackson broke the ice.
Yes.
He created a new American possibility, a new style, a new possibility. And then de Kooning, 1948, with his show, very close in time. And now they're friends, they're drinking friends, and they're rivals. Something's happening. European art has lost its energy. And there's Black Mountain, 1948, at the center of these things. And so style, this is the only style. They they could paint it. This was modern American style. And it wasn't a matter of just looking around and saying, how shall we paint? This is how they had to paint. It expresses Americanism, it expresses their personalities, their skill, and their knowledge of history. These paintings all have a lot of history in them. So that's what happens in the 40s and 50s. Then it's such a shock. It's always a shock. They were the avant-garde. Everyone was saying, oh, my kid can do that. So they were fighting popular opinion. And then they're the avant-garde, and suddenly along comes Warhol with a new avant-garde, and it's so shocking to them that, because that seems like a completely made up, public relations oriented, superficial, cynical.
Well, Warhol was an advertiser.
I think Warhol's a very important figure, but he knocked the socks out of abstract expressionism. The next generation came along so quickly. So style is very important. History, very important.
Yeah, I mean, and don't forget that this is a period, and slightly, you know, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, that this is a period where this isn't just happening in painting, right? You read what Aaron Copland has to say in music, right? And he's spending time in France, in Paris, in England, in other places, and he's seeing that each of these cultures has their own art. You know, they have their own. They have their painting. There's French painting, and there's French classical music. You know, and he's a guy from New York, Copland. You know, and he's looking for that quintessentially American music, right? He's saying, well, how can I compose American symphonies and American music? And of course, we all know that he ended up connecting to something like jazz. He connected to jazz as a musical form that was quintessentially American, and there would be no Aaron Copland. There would be no Appalachian Spring or any of or really the Kid or anything like that without jazz, right? So people are trying in this general period to find, you know, because America is such a new culture, right? We're such a young country. We don't reach back to the Magna Carta, you know, or whatever, you know, back, you know, like Europe does. And they're trying to say, okay, it's time. It's our time. It's our time to sort of develop it, to stop imitating other models and to create our own.
And you get the same thing with American literature, which
Exactly.
you all know more about than I do, but
Yes.
Hemingway is the great American
Yes.
writer of this period.
Who's thumbing his nose at European law, and Henry James.
Faulkner, Henry Miller, the plays of Henry Miller, all are part of this. You see Marlon Brando On the Waterfront. He's basically Pollock. You've got to watch those early films. They're fantastic stuff. All this happens in the late 50s. It all goes together as one cultural package. We should have a program on that.
Anybody else
Pay tuition.
want to ask a question? Oh, go ahead.
Okay, as we're sitting here in the home of the Black Mountain School, I'm curious, Paul and Clyde, if in the house where art wasn't a topic, it was so important but not discussed, was Black Mountain. I'm wondering if you recall if your dad ever talked about this place.
He did. That's one of the things he did talk about. There was another guy who was a close friend of the family. We saw all the time, and who I actually studied writing with. A guy named Fielding Dawson. I don't know if you know of N.F. Dawson, who died young, sadly. And he was a great friend of my father's. My father's attitude towards Fee was that a little went a long way. Fee was a very pungent and very, extroverted personality, but he liked him a lot. And Fee went to Black Mountain after, and he was more of the era of the writers.
Okay.
And Fee was a writer. He was a novelist. And he was also a painter, but mostly known as a writer. So there were conversations that one had in in the kitchen or up front, with Fee and people like that, where Black Mountain would come up. I mean, I had no idea what they were talking about, but they, that later, when I studied writing with them, we talked about Black Mountain, but we mostly talked about it in terms of Creeley,
Okay.
and Olson and people like that. He was, Dawson was like a complete acolyte of Olson's. So, my father himself, did he talk about Black Mountain? Sometimes. I had the opportunity to do an interview with him. I filmed an interview with him. Made him very uncomfortable. So it kind of got, the kibosh was put on it fairly quickly. But I do have some videotape of him. And in one of those sections, he does talk about, how important it was to be a Black Mountain, how he met. He didn't talk about it in terms of learning skills or being exposed to mentors so much. He talked about it in terms of meeting friends, people, because he and de Kooning were close for all their lives.
Didn't he get that
And
back
Pat-
lifelong friendship?
Yeah, Pat and Milton, her husband, they were over a lot. More Pat than Milton. They're both the ones we saw.
But Milton wasn't at Black Mountain.
No, he
Milton
wasn't.
Pat was.
That's true. Milton is the more highly regarded, with the vicissitudes of
Milton is Milton Resnick.
Milton Resnick. Yeah, he's the more highly regarded of the two painters. And probably for good reason. He was a very good painter. He and my father talked a lot. They were pretty much. And I remember, but I do remember Fee and I do remember Ray talking on tape about Black Mountain, about his friends.
Let me,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we should close in a few minutes, and let me ask, I'm curious to get to Paul and Clyde, and out of this kind of depressed, quiet, maybe embittered father and a working mother, this little Jewish family on the Lower East Side, right out of a novel, that we get these two very, very accomplished, articulate, professorial types, both very well educated and gifted people. And where did you come from?
I'm not sure we accept the assumptions embedded in your question.
Well, take a risk.
Well, you grow up in New York and you automatically something is done to you. Right? They give you some kind of pill. I don't know whether it's the blue pill or the red pill, but they give you some kind of pill. You're just seeing, I grew up in a time where, the East Village was coming into its own. It was just starting to be called the East Village. It used to be called the Lower East Side. It was part of the Lower East Side. It was getting its own name because it was competing with the West Village, Greenwich Village. Around the corner was, the Fillmore East, the Electric Circus. There was hippies everywhere. The parties I would go to would have strange people there. I was at a party, regular, Ginsberg was always at these parties that I was at. I would see W.H. Auden around. George Plimpton was around. Who else? Oh, I played handball with Zero Mostel. Zero Mostel was like looking over the galleries, the galleries on 10th Street, and I think you were there. Were we not playing handball together against the wall of the Stewart House? No, the St. Mark's.
Zero Mostel
And Jack Guilford.
Jack Guilford and Phil Silvers came a couple of times, right?
I don't remember Phil Silvers. This is editing. This is revisionist history.
Guilford, you may remember among other things from the old Cracker Jack commercials.
Yeah, that's where most people know.
Was visiting the galleries a lot with Zero Mostel.
Yeah, they were both in. The funny thing happened on the way to the Forum.
Which parent encouraged your educational advances?
Mother.
You know,
The mother. In fact, she insisted we call her mother.
Yes, that's right. My mother, who really deserves recognition, you know, in all of this too. Very interesting mix of a very, very highly intelligent woman, and she had kind of this dual aspect to her where she very much partook of the art world and very committed to what my father was doing and to the sort of intelligentsia kind of ideas associated with it. She was very interested to some degree in psychoanalysis and a lot of the other things that were going on. She also at the same time had a very, I felt, and I certainly got a strong dose of this, a sort of a more middle class set of ambitions for kids. Aspirations, thank you. And very much, you know, I have a kind of sort of a guilt education, which is really due mostly to her insisting on that. So she had both the art world thing and the please become a lawyer or something like that thing. And so, but so I certainly think that she plays a major role in that. But I also, you know, want to pay tribute to her as somebody who was just very, very intelligent and complicated, like my father.
Yeah, and she was actually analyzed by Paul Goodman, who wrote the book on, you know, with Fritz Perls on Michelle therapy, and I was named for a book. So, you know, she was really a part of that intelligentsia that Clyde talks about. She considered, I mean, she was a bohemian without feeling the need to call herself that. One of her great claims to fame was that she was the first person in the village to walk around in sandals. Remember that? Yeah.
Yes.
One question. I know Pat Kozlov had like a manifesto that she wrote about her work, and many of the painters were writing. Did your father or I don't know?
No, I mean what we can gather of my father's views really, you know, in written format, come out in interviews that were done with him. There was an interview that I discovered the transcript of, which was done for a book about this world. That was with my father, Dan Rice, and what's his name? The guy who started the club, Pavia. You know, Philip Pavia. Yeah, and my father was, you know, startlingly, it wasn't that I was surprised, but it was pretty cool. He was very articulate in this about what was going on at the time, what he believed, and what motivated him. You know, there's also correspondence. You know, when I went to live in Italy for 2 years, a little less than 2 years, and somehow that started a correspondence between me and my father, where I guess when we were on separate continents it was easier, you know, and we actually talked about, and in the arrogance of my youth, I mean, I hate to admit this, but it's sort of my cleansing. You know, I actually said to him in a letter, what is it like to be a failed artist? This is what young people do. I mean, we're so many people. And this is what he said. He said, I thought I could do everything. He said, I thought I could have my art and my painting, and also have a family, and also, you know, and this was very rare in that world. You know, very few of these luminaries were married, and those that were, like Bill, were only married, you know? So he was trying to do two things. He overextended himself clearly in a big way, and he felt that was the tragedy of his life, that you can only serve one master. You know, you're either going to do, you can't do both. Not everybody agrees with that assessment, but that's how he felt about it. At least when he wrote that letter. You know. But as far as theories of art or anything like that,
No, I mean
think
poetry or something.
poetry?
Yeah, you
No,
know,
he always claimed. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a lot of poems when I was younger and continued to sporadically, and in fact defined myself in those days as a poet. And I would bring them back. My mother would get very into them and would talk to me late into the night about them. My father would read them, God bless So no, he didn't write poetry, he didn't write essays. He wrote some letters to the New York Times that got published, usually about the real estate development deals that he was against. He was very involved in the anti-war movement. He considered himself an anarchist pacifist, right? And my mother pretty much did too, I would say. I hold over from the days when you could be an anarchist. Now, if anybody calls Bernie Sanders a socialist, everybody loses their shit. Oh my God, a socialist, But my father and mother came from a time when that was a legitimate thing to be, in the 30s and 40s. Smart people were communists until they saw what Stalinism did, and then they all fled. So he didn't write a lot about what he thought. We have a few snippets and a few interviews.
Thank you.
That's a good place to leave it, I think.
Oh, wait a minute, he has a question.
I got a bunch of questions.
Okay.
In any sense, do you feel that these are biographical or autobiographical in any sense? Not necessarily events, but many of the abstract expressionists, they're reflecting what's going on emotionally at that time. And do you see any of that? Is that evident in any of the work?
Do you want to take that?
No.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you. The simple answer, the short answer is no. And I leave it to others maybe to define that. The longer answer is kind of. What I got from spending so much time with, there are 170 paintings that I could be cataloged, plus about 2,500 works on paper. And the first thing we had to do was we had to assess what we had and do an inventory. And we had to measure them. And my wife Lou had to take pictures, photographs of them, right? So that we did the measurements, and then we had to decide what the media was, and we had to put it in the gallery. So I was looking at, measuring, trying to take stock of these paintings over and over and over again, going around and around the 170 works, right? Until I began to see things in them. You can call it the hallucination of like a guy in the desert thinks he sees an oasis there, right? But maybe it was actually that I was just beginning to see attempts, nailed it. Attempts, nailed it. Attempts. In other words, that there was some artistic problem. I think Ted is very much on the right track when he says that these paintings are about painting, right? It's very difficult to draw any easy autobiographical connection, but what you can see is an intelligence and dare I say, a soul that is trying to figure some artistic problem out, right? And that he's kind of not getting it, it's not working, but he doesn't give up. And that is an incredible thing to suddenly discern, that somebody is trying to figure out something, doesn't make it, and then you see that it's there, and after that, there are no more attempts. So it just stops there. It just stops there, and then he's on to something else. So, yeah.
So they're all, the answer is, you're absolutely right.
Yes.
No, they're not autobiographical, and yes, they all are.
Yes, they are.
They tell the story of a life.
They do, and they tell us, and it's not just mechanical, it's not robotic, it's not just about technique or anything like that. You can see a real person at work here, a person who I would say we never knew until we knew his paintings.
Okay, thank you all.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
We'll do it after.
Yeah. know about it. Oh, he did? Oh, that's right.
And that's why it was hard, she didn't have the outreach.
She knew exactly what.
So she knew exactly these that she would have.
Oh, I'm sure she was
right?
thrilled, she's totally thrilled.
And
I'm sorry.
so it's
Yeah.
really,
Didn't interfere.
I'm glad. I was just thinking.
submitted and also bring
Yeah, because the board was just.
Well, he put it on the rental, and he knew, and I was, we were all, was
Right.
it was just down the street.
Yeah, when my mom was running to Canada during and, you know, seeing this, they were, running to photo booths and things.
I didn't register for the draft. When I was a, held out, I was like, I was constant touching the Sorry. Just finish this.
Same story.
Well, it's messy. Our connection is, you know, and Marty,
So I was in constant connection with them and talking to advisors. And finally, in the end, said, you know, you're on the list. And you know, it wasn't even like, I mean, the Vietnam War was really over. All there was Cambodia. And then, finally he just said, look, it doesn't matter. You betrayed yourself for no reason.
whatever.
You know, so
I feel I'm a steward.
and I never.
But, the other question.
Well, he took me to all my first demonstrations. I was in 1967, and I think at the age of Washington, where we were trying to raise the Pentagon. We all made a circle around the Pentagon, we failed, but we were trying. I got tear gas at the age of 11 and put in a lockout at the age of 11 in my parents. Did I not? Okay.
You did, I apologize. I don't know. Yeah. Did you really? I'm so happy to know you're and it was like,
I think it was probably exacerbated by the few.
I mean, yes, I'm actually so, you know, what else? Well, this house actually, I didn't know until. Work on it. Yeah, we built it on She and Gregory left because I was like, so yeah, like 25 years. Oh, God, I got a call. I won't get it. But I do understand.
I have a website that calls stories
My son, we have 25 years. You know, sobriety has nothing to do with it. No, I know. I mean, I think he is the embodiment of sobriety. Stop. And yet, you see it like, really real